Welcome, everyone, to this afternoon session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we will be focusing on a new book by Vanderbilt historian Helmut Walser Smith entitled Germany, a Nation in Its Time Before, During, and After Nationalism, 1500 to 2000, published earlier this year by Liveright, an imprint of W.W. Norton. Joining us this afternoon as well are Charles Mayer of Harvard and Suzanne Marchand of Louisiana State University, who will serve as discussants for our panel. I'm Eric Arneson from George Washington University, the co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my colleague Christian Osterman of the Wilson Center. The seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. And for the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly, usually, if not always, on Mondays. We have a very full lineup of authors and books for the remaining of the fall. And if you haven't already signed on to our listserv, I invite you to go to our organization's respective websites for the list of what we'll be featuring over the next few months and/or to sign up. Behind the scenes, we've got two people who make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. And I'd like to thank two institutional supporters, the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest and the George Washington University Department of History, as well as a number of anonymous individual donors. And as always, we invite you to join their ranks. On the logistics front, you should know today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of this webinar, we ask those with questions to use the raise hand function on Zoom. To those watching on Facebook Live, you can email a question to ourweekly@historians.org. We'll try to call on as many folks as we can. And with that, I turn the screen over to Christian Osterman, who will be moderating today's session. Christian.
Thanks so much, Eric. I am really delighted to introduce and to moderate today's panel, which will begin a conversation about Germany, a nation in its time, a conversation to which we invite all of you in about 30 to 40 minutes to join us. Feel free to use the raise hand function, as Eric just mentioned, the Zoom room functionality to get in line, or email Rachel Wheatley. You can start raising your hand as you think of questions. We'll start with the author, Professor Helmut Walser Smith. Dr. Smith is the Martha Rivers Ingram Professor of History at Vanderbilt University. He's the editor of the Oxford Handbook of Modern German History and the author of The Continuities of German History, Nation, Religion, and Race Across the Long 19th Century, published in 2008, and the widely acclaimed The Butcher's Tale, Murder and Anti-Semitism in a German Town, published by Norton in 2002, which won the Frankel Prize in Contemporary German History. He's the author of a number of other books. He's the recipient of a number of awards and prizes, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, which I think underwrote some of the research for the book we're talking about today. He is currently working on a new book, tentatively entitled Facing the Past in Small Town Germany, 1945 to 2000, as well as an Atlas of German Studies. Helmut will speak for about 10 minutes about his book, after which I'll introduce our two distinguished commentators. Helmut, the Zoom room is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, especially to Christian Osterman and Eric Arneson for inviting me to this wonderful series, and as well to Sue Marchand and Charles Mayer for agreeing to comment on this book, which is not exactly a short one. Now, for most people, the launch pad for writing a nonfiction book is when they know something. Maybe even when they know something better than almost everyone else. This is not the case with me. I more typically start when I don't understand something, when it doesn't fit, when I get something wrong. This was the case with this book. And the thing that did not fit was a map. I even have the map here. This is not high-tech technology, but what I'm showing you is a paper reproduction of Erhard Etzlaub's Rome Way map of 1500. It has, oops, I have it upside down. It has a southern orientation. You will recognize the country more easily this way because we're used to seeing it the other way around. But this is the map. It has a southern orientation. The thing that I didn't understand, the problem, was not actually, however, its southern orientation. It was something else. It was the instructions that Etzlaub gave to his workshop painters. And these were to paint Germany as a nation surrounded by other nations and kingdoms. I had been taught that nationalists make nations, not the reverse, as Ernest Gellner famously wrote, or that nations are imaginary communities, as Ben Anderson argued, while situating them in the late 18th century. Anderson also wrote that we should understand these imaginary communities, quote, not by their falsity or genuineness, but by the style in which they are imagined. But then I thought, were not these maps expressions of a kind of nationness rendered in a particular style, perhaps the style of imagining of the era circa 1500? So this was me not understanding something. And the questions that I had first led to what was the initial conception of this work, and that was to trace the concept and expression of a nation, the German nation, in the styles in which it was in fact imagined. The book begins in 1500 because that, roughly speaking, is when the first accurate and scaled depictions of Germany as a nation appears. The starting point then was not a book about, well, I'm sorry, the starting point was then a book about nation or the concept of nation before nationalism. And then I had planned to write about nation also during nationalism. It was originally intended to stop in 1945. It was not meant to be about maps, but about the whole range of cultural artifacts, including textual ones, that expressed what a nation is and how we know it, how the Germans at the time knew it. Then circa 2006, actually not circa, in 2006, and Christian is nodding his head. He knows exactly what I'm referring to. In 2006, in the summer of that year, Germany held the World Cup. And I happened to be lucky enough to be there, not in the stadium so much as on the fan miles and on the Kudamm. And there I started to think it would be good to bring this story to the present. We had talked so much about Germany rejoining the West. We had talked so much about Germany becoming a democracy or becoming part of the European Union. We had talked about it becoming, to quote, re-civilized. But the question of nation conceptions after the catastrophe of World War II and after the genocide was either not really addressed or not brought together with a conception of the relationship between nation and nationalism in the longue durée, in the long term. And this was what I now hope to do. But it presented a problem. The problem was, of course, that nationalism was no longer the end of the story. Or maybe put differently, it was not the only thing to be explained. This was at first very disorienting for me, and I wasn't exactly sure how to proceed. In fact, it took me an embarrassingly long time to figure this out, to figure out something that in retrospect looks very basic and almost self-evident to me. And this is the basic underlying proposition of the book as it now stands. And this is that not nationalism is the larger story, but nation is. The history of the evolving, changing conceptions of what a nation is and how you know it, That is the story with a long history. That is the story with chronological depth. From this insight, it follows that nationalism can be seen as a chapter within this longer story of changing conceptions of nationhood. Put differently, as it is in fact put in the subtitle, there is a nation before, during, and after nationalism, or at least there can be, or at least that would be one way of writing this story. Now, at some level, this was a liberating moment because it allowed me to write about what I'd thought I was seeing actually, and one could debate this. It allowed me to write what I thought I was seeing, especially in the young people in the summer on the fan mile in the summer of 2006. Namely, something like nation identity, nation expressions after nationalism. But this idea also unsettled me. After all, we know that there is nationalism in Germany. We know that it is sometimes even often exclusionary, as it is in the United States as well. And so I had to find a differentiating vocabulary, and I didn't have it at the time. I went about writing the book and hoping the problem would somehow solve itself. And then when I was about 2/3 into the book, one of our esteemed colleagues, Jim Sheehan, generously offered to take a look at the manuscript. And within a very short and exemplary short amount of time, he actually sent me back 2 single-space type criticisms of the book, showing in this chapter works okay in this sense, but not in this sense. It was a very good criticism, but towards the end, it was also emboldening because he said there's a lot which is good here, but he also said something else. He also says it did not yet cohere. It seems like a series of studies still. So I always think of this as one short sentence for Jim Sheehan, 3 more years of work for me, because of course he was right. It did not at that point cohere, and I needed to figure out a way to make it cohere. And there were 2 dimensions to this coherence. The first was the argument. What was, after all, the argument for the longue durée? Why even bother talking about nation in 1500, which seems so very, very vastly different from nation in the 1930s or the 1940s, or indeed the 1980s. And slowly, and with the help of some friends and talking about it, I came to the insight, also embarrassingly, it took me embarrassingly long to figure this one out, that this has to be an argument about, I hesitate to say this word because I wrote a book called The Continuity of German History, but I realized that this in the very long term has to be about a certain kind of discontinuity, about the change in the fundamental morphology of nationhood, about different and sometimes radically different, about sometimes radically different ways of understanding the nation and how it changed over time. It had to be about something like Michel Foucault's epistemological ruptures, and I had to show how they came about. So that's why it also, once again, took longer. But the second thing is that it also forced me into more differentiations about nationalism and its hold and impact on German society. And this is when I happened upon, or rather became reacquainted with, Kant's famous essay, What is Enlightenment? Was ist Aufklärung? Published in 1784. And many of you, especially the Germanists, can say this sentence probably by heart. Do we live in an enlightened age? Kant asked, and the answer was no. We live in an age of enlightenment. So this differentiation was the basis of a further and important differentiation for me between living in an age of nationalism, where nationalism is one competing discourse among many, and a nationalist age in which it is a dominant discourse driving the polity and driving to a radical place. And that is the discourse that allowed, or that is the distinction that I believe allowed me to understand the difference between the early 20th century nationalism and the incredible violence it wrought, and 19th century nationalism, which has a very different place in society. And it also allowed me to see, and this was very important to the post-war period, it allowed me to see the new nationalism in the 1980s, not merely as a recrudescence of the 1940s, but as in a fundamentally different structural place and part of a recrudescence of nationalism, a different kind later, part of maybe even a global kind of nationalism in the 1980s. With that, those fundamental structural thoughts, I'll stop here. And I very much look forward to the commentators, the discussions, and the participants and their questions.
Thanks so much, Helmut. I love how you led us in your struggles with the subject and with the book. I think for any of us scholars, but also for many of the students, PhD students who are taking, starting to work, this is so insightful and encouraging. We are very fortunate to have two of this country's leading historians of Germany, of Europe, with us today to comment on Helmut's presentation and his landmark study. Suzanne Marchand and Charles Mayer. Let me introduce them in alphabetical order. Charles Mayer is the Leverett Seltenstall Professor of History at Harvard University. He received his AB and PhD from Harvard in 1960 and 1967, respectively, with an interim year of study at St. Anthony's College in Oxford. Among his many books are Recasting Bourgeois Europe, 1975, published in 1975, The Unmasterable Past, History, Holocaust, and German National Identity, published in 1988, and most recently, Once Within Borders, Territories of Power, Wealth, and Belonging, published in 2016. He's currently writing an interpretive history of the last 100 years, tentatively entitled, Charlie, update us if this is wrong, A New Spirit of the Laws. Among his many fellowships, prizes, and awards are the Cross of Honor of the German Federal Republic, and I'm proud to say 2 Wilson Center fellowships, including his most recent stint with us as a distinguished fellows a couple of years ago. Suzanne Marchand is Louisiana State University Systems Boyd Professor of European Intellectual History at LSU in Baton Rouge. Marchand obtained her BA from UC Berkeley and her PhD from the University of Chicago, 1992, served as an assistant and associate professor at Princeton University before moving to LSU in 1999. She's the author of Down from Olympus, Archaeology and Philhellenism in Germany, 1750 to 1870, published in 1996. German Orientalism in the Age of Empire, Race, Religion, and Scholarship, published in 2009. And most recently, she has attempted to combine, I think succeeded, to combine cultural and economic history in Porcelain, a history from the heart of Europe, published just this year. And I'm really intrigued by the title and to look forward to reading this. She is currently working on a history of Herodotus reception since 1700, tentatively titled Histories and Lies. She has received a number of grants and fellowships and prizes as well from the Humboldt Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and Louisiana Board of Regents. She's been awarded fellowships by the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin in 2000 and the Max Planck Institute for Wissenschaftsgeschichte in Berlin as well, perhaps most relevant to the subject of discussion today. With that, let me turn it over to you, Charlie, and then Sue. Charlie, the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you, Christian. And thank you, Helmut, for writing such a lovely book. I think all good books have to begin with questions. I understand yours. This is a very imaginative approach to German history, because the book is, in a sense, a synthesis of German history, at least German historical thinking, Germans thinking about their nation. And it was delightful. I really appreciated the maps and the images and the spatial thinking. And part of my questions will return to that. The book takes up asks the question: what spaces can define a national unit, especially in Central Europe, where there are competing imperial units, where rivers run north to south and chop up ethnicities. In a sense, you start this book thinking the Germans are looking for, with their homeland in a literal sense, their space, and it's not clear who they are or what that space is. Later, the book switches to bring in other factors, especially language, which is obviously the usual factor that defines ethnicity, and as Helmut explained, central to Herder, who was the theorist of language and ethnicity for the German as a index of nationality. And with this, he gets to the Romantic age, the priority of language. Now, part of the problem for Germans has always been, as Helmut says, is where is it? Where does it, and especially where does it end? And that's not clear. And it especially became the whole question of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation was an institutional effort to fudge that question, to fudge the answer to that. It's both an empire and a nation, and it's somewhere there over more or less of Central Europe. This became a huge issue, of course, in 1848 between the differing solutions, Klein-Deutschland and Groß-Deutschland, and what you excluded from Germany. The question then in 1848 is, who did you leave out? And the Hungarians, the Austrians said, well, we're not going to leave any of our empire out. And this became an unsustainable proposition for German nationalists gathered at Frankfurt. So this ambiguity of empire and German nation remains, and I think it remains, as Helmut suggests or would suggest, in the very title of the German Bismarckian nation, which was defined as the Das Deutsche Reich, and even the Weimar Republic, which defined itself as Das Deutsche Reich, and then this last vicious, violent effort to create a huge German Reich with subordinate parts. Now, let me contrast. I think it may be helpful to make a couple of contrasts. What are the other geographical units that Helmut might have chosen, or any German historian might choose to think about Germany? One is the state. Contrast Helmut's book with Chris Clark's very fine history of Prussia called Iron Kingdom. For Clark, rightly emphasized, Prussia is a state. It is almost a mechanism, and it can include territories, a manorial Lutheran territories with a large servile population in the east, and much more differentiated commercial territories along the Rhine and elsewhere. And it keeps on agglomerating territories, ultimately Frankfurt for a few years. So the state is is a major alternative, and a lot of the history of Germany is the history of discovering the state, such as Meineke's work in 1906, Die Weltbürgertum und Nationalstaat. The other is the empire, which of course he takes up. The third is the nation, which is his big question, what he's been seeking for. And then there's another fourth level, which you might suggest is Heimat, which Helmut's colleague Celia Applegate has written about and is a very, has been a very engaging concept. Mac Walker did a wonderful job with German hometowns. It's the local, it's the regional, it's the area, being implanted. I sense the nation actually also in the with a soccer match, but it was the year 1990 when I was in Germany. The first unification treaty, but not the final second one, had been signed. Germany was in a World Cup, and the same crowds, the same people, kids were singing Deutschland über alles. The first verse of which it was not supposed to be sung, and which I hadn't heard sung. They didn't seem terribly menacing. They were wrapped with German flags. It was, to me, it showed that wir sind wieder wer. We Germans are back in some sense. I've worried about the state because when I wrote on territory, where I was very interested in maps, I was interested in borders as a defining aspect of territory, and that's what's so problematic about Germany. So, in a sense, I think these are great questions, and they come up. I think Helmut's been agonizing with them on behalf of all of us, I'd say, in a certain sense. So thank you for doing that work. I'm still interested. I was amused, Helmut. I guess it's a family occupation. You cite my daughter, actually, who writes on maps, Jessica Mayer, on Italian maps. I know you didn't know that, but I thought I'd give a plug for the family. She's a Renaissance art historian.
Oh, wonderful.
So, I guess let me just. So I think all these, it's, if I were doing 2 books on German history, I could assign kids 2 books, and of course, I think I might assign Chris Clark's book and your book as a tandem, and ask them to think about the tensions between them. I would ask. These aren't really, they're questions, but they're problems I find, and I'd like you to think about them or reflect on them and respond. In some ways, the book becomes a more ordinary history as it goes along through time. It starts with maps, space. Where is this place? What is this place? Maybe I love it because because of my territory interests, or just, I'm a foreign traveler in 1500. I'm less of one in 1900. But it seems to me that the book, in fact, there are maps, they're later on, but they're maps of concentration camps to a large extent, extermination centers. They belong to German history, alas. You make the point that they're hardly all of German history, but the history does seem to me, as it progresses in time, a more ordinary history. Ethnicity crowds out spatiality almost, in some sense, and that ethnicity becomes more and more restrictively defined from here on. First, in terms of until ultimately it's German plus non-Jewish Aryan civic consciousness, and so I wondered whether I realized the book is on Germany nationhood, but the transition from space to these other factors seem to be to one of the points that I would raise, not to critique, not to criticize the book, but to ask about the presuppositions and how the research program had to be modified in time as you discovered new problems in time. The second question I would raise is that I am not less sure that the age of nationalism versus a nationalist age is as robust a distinction as anymore as Kant would have had it, or as you would have it. I mean, can you have an age of nationalism which is not potentially going to become a nationalist age? It doesn't have to become that, but when I consider the United States today and our imminent elections, that transition, that line seems less watertight, hermetically sealed than it might be. And I think that's what are the conditions that can prevent an age of nationalism or a national consciousness from becoming abusive and becoming nationalist. This is in a sense, the political problem, I think, that the book raises for me. So those are the two issues, I guess, I'd really like you to address. I mean, are we, I don't think we're entering an age of nationalism per se. I think we are entering perhaps an age of would-be strongmen and would-be authoritarians again. But these transitions, the trouble is with every political unit, has the potential for good or bad. An imperial unit can become, it can sound great when you have Virgil singing the praises of Augustus, but it doesn't sound so good if you're, a British tribesman looking at Agricola, or an African tribesman looking at, Germans in Southwest Africa and Namibia. So I think this difficulty of holding these potentials, if you ever return to it, that's the area I think requires you to take up more agonizing questions on behalf of all of us. So with those two observations, I'll turn it over to Suzanne.
Actually, thank you, Charlie, so much. Let's give Helmut a chance to respond and then.
Okay, sure.
Oh, I was hoping. Okay. Thanks, Charlie. These are hard questions. But this question about the robustness of the differentiation between the age of nationalism and the nationalist age, aside from it being a sort of a tongue twister, is really actually very important to me, because it speaks directly, as you sensed, it speaks directly to, I don't like to put it this way because it is a work of scholarship and it took me a long time to figure it out, but there is a politics behind it. And the politics has to do with the idea that even now, it's important not to cede the nation for people who would want to make the nation more progressive, more open, more tolerant, and so on. So I think that, and this is in a way what the 2006 moment was for me, because I saw the possibility of young Germans next to young French people, next to Spanish people, and sort of saying, yes, this is who we are, it's okay, and dancing together. And it was a moment where you could imagine that this is a kind of Herderian understanding, right? The Herderian understanding was not that nations struggle amongst one another in the hour of their extinction. It was that it's more like flowers in a garden. Now, you could say that there's a lot of naivete involved in this, but I think that the more politically dangerous thing is to completely cede this very old identification, namely nation, to people who don't share an understanding of nation among other nations. I mean, this was what I loved about the Etzlaub map. He was saying, this wasn't nationalism, this was Etzlaub saying, when we picture Germany, we picture it among other nations and empires. It's the amongness that I think was really important. And it's that one of many that has a political resonance for me. It's very interesting. I spent a lot of time, as you know, with the Allensbach, demoscopic survey results, and I followed them all the way from the very beginning until I have all of them here in my shelves. I read them all through, and one of the things that struck me was that even in the late 90s, in the early 2000s, when you were asking Germans to make a decision, if they have to take a decision about whether or not they're German or European, I mean, obviously a lot will say we're both. But when you ask them to make a decision, 85% said, well, it's more German. And a lot of my progressive friends would cringe at this, but it's also a kind of reality. And I think that it's a reality that we ignore at our peril. So to me, there is something important behind the idea that you can have a society that entertains nation as an important identifying factor without it becoming, that is to say, the age of nationalism does not have to become the nationalist age. I think there's a way of creating a society so that it is one of a series of discourses. It's one of a series of identification, and one that may well matter. It also matters because we can wish a different kind of world, but we all know that when it comes to take Germany, but the United States is not that different in this respect. When it comes to welfare, when it comes to police, when it comes to a whole series of laws, when it comes to taking care, it's also, the nation is the container of this basket of good, of this structure of laws. And while supranational institutions are important, and I do think the overlapping of them is a moment of historical progress in a way, it's nevertheless, I think it's way too early to imagine that we can put nation in this sense behind us politically, conceptually, or anything like that. When we think of people who are born in the world and die, more than 95% of the world still dies in the same country they're born in. So even in this age of sort of ramped up globalization, I think that we have to find a way to talk about the nation without and narrate it in such a way that it doesn't imply a slipping into the nationalist age, which is a thing we really want a normative thing we want to avoid, I think. So, and then the second about the more conventional, let's say, second half of the book. I hear you, and I felt that to some extent. So I accept the criticism, but I would say I accept it only to some extent. And this is that in that moment that I had to ask myself, what are the different morphological incarnations? What are those different parts of the book? What are the different kinds of nations that I'm talking about? In those sections, I had to ask myself the questions that you have taught your students to ask for a long time. What is the purpose of this nation? What does it do? What work does it do? And that very quickly leads you to see that the work that it does in the 19th century is very different than the work that it does in the early 20th century, which I argue is largely, it's the period where Germany is largely a warfare state. Now, obviously there's a Weimar Republic, it's not all that, but it is centered on war in a way in which it is not in any other period, with the possible exception of the early 16th. That different function gives the whole question of how I described it a different cast. And it's true that I could have, in that point, brought back more and more of the like the spatial dimensions. There are a lot of regrets I have in this book about what is left out, you can imagine. And among them is a more thorough explanation of the various ideas in Ostraum, for example, that the Nazis entertained. And I cut out a whole section, Generalplan Ost, which pained me to do. And there are lots of reasons it should have been in there. But I think that the real issue is that I came back to, I felt like in those later chapters, I had to explain a very different thing that nations are doing. And that's, I think, wrenched me into a somewhat more conventional narrative.
Thank you. Let's bring Sue into the conversation if you don't mind. And then Charlie, there'll be another chance to get back on. Sue, the mic is yours.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for waiting.
It's really a great pleasure to comment on this just masterful book. I want to say at the outset that the organizers were very clear that we were not to spend all our time praising the book. So although I could easily spend 10 minutes or 10 hours praising this book, I won't do that in the detail that it deserves. It is a masterpiece by a master craftsman of German history. And I think it really legitimizes the effort of writing a long book over time and putting so much personal and scholarly attention into the work. And I'm glad Jim encouraged you to do that, because this is what we do best, is to write these lasting works of humanistic scholarship. So thank you for demonstrating that so beautifully, Helmut. And it is, as I said in another set of comments about this book, one of the things I find most engaging, beautiful, and moving about it is that I think it is a profoundly literary work, particularly a poetic work. Goethe is reputed to have said that the life of a man is like a poem. It has a beginning and an end, but it doesn't form a whole. And I think that speaks to these discontinuity questions in very interesting ways. There's an intricate and beautiful construction to this book, and it comes off being rather more, to me, more poetic than conventionally historical. And for that, particularly as an intellectual historian, I really raise my hat. Helmut introduced this question of uncertainty early on, and starting from a question you don't know. And clearly, to me, speaking of the poetics of the book, the question that was posed by Goethe and Schiller, Germany, but where does it lie, is really, the sort of fundamental hook on which this book is built, and it radiates forward and backward through the book, underwriting Helmut's claim that the era of nationalism is a brief, if important, chapter in what I would call a Heraclitean story. You can put your toe in one place and it will never be the same in another. By shifting our focus from nationalism to nation, by following that often broken red thread of the learning of compassion for one's neighbors, Helmut's able to produce a work that takes into account a plethora of topics and source materials that are usually omitted from German histories, things like Gryphius's laments, W.E.B. Du Bois's endorsements of German open-mindedness, the grumblings of great war soldiers about their rations, and even the TV miniseries, The Holocaust. The narrative begins with those incommensurable itineraries and maps, and then follows the progressive, though punctuated, process of the interiorizing of national identity. And in fact, in Smith's hands, and I don't know if anyone else felt this way, the process of finding the nation, coming to nationalism, is so attenuated that I felt a bit like the moviegoer who kept expecting something to jump out at you from the back closet. And my expectations for closure were deliberately, time and again, if artfully, frustrated. I turned the pages wanting to know, are we there yet? Are we there yet? But for a very long time, we are not. Nationalism, he argues, makes a Copernican turn around 1806, but it means nothing to most people until after 1871, even after 1905. Indeed, German national indifference seems to survive even after 1914, when the granddaddy of all revisionists, Eugene Weber, had peasants turning into Frenchmen. On Helmut's account, nationalism as an institutionally anchored and fully interiorized reality arrives only in 1918 or 1924, as I read it. That may not be fair. In the crucible of Weimar chaos, it quickly morphs into folkish racism, which engulfs and poisons the whole polity, especially after 1938. After the destruction of this ultimate form of nationalism in 1945, the German nation returns to a kind of fragmented, largely unrepentant limbo. It's only in the wake of Richard Weizsäcker's 1985 speech that Germans have really adopted what he calls a realist form, or in his introductory remarks, he called it a style of nationalism that allows them to grieve and atone for the nation's crimes. The poignant moment of Weizsäcker's speech provides something of a provisional endpoint, marking the point, perhaps at which the German soul has at long last found entrance into purgatorio, or perhaps it just seems so as others of us have descended into our own national infernos. In a previous set of reflections on this book, I described it also as a Sonderwegless German history. And I now realize this is not quite right, as the Sonderweg famously had to do with the supposedly missing middle class and long surviving traditions of authoritarian rule. Helmut brilliantly sidesteps this by essentially avoiding traditional political and economic history, and he indulges in few cross-European comparisons. But Sonderweg analyses were also about the dangers of especially virulent forms of nationalism and, of course, anti-Semitism, which in Helmut's book do not appear until after 1918, that deftly sidestepping the fraught question of the origins of the Great War. This is a very brave and thought-provoking revisionist historiographical intervention. But if we accept it, we will have to rethink a narrative that runs through so many of our works, including, I think, some of his own. That is really a challenge to us all, one that has moral as well as historiographical implications. And Helmut has already addressed this, but it poses the question, can we, should we take the danger out of German nationalism? Now, I want to underline that I'm not accusing Helmut in any way of normalizing German history, as was attempted in the Historiker Streit, about which Charlie has written so eloquently. No one who reads his chapters, unflinching, heart-wrenching, on the Holocaust victims, perpetrators, and bystanders could make such a claim. But I am asking him to reflect on the consequences of this very short-term chronology. What now can be said about the origins of National Socialism and the Judaicide? Are there any continuities in German history, or was the latter simply the product, as he almost says, of calculations about the food supply in 1941? And I'm wondering if this strict form of revisionism, keeping to what the actors in the day knew and felt, and waiting for everyone to get on the same page, does not in some way abnegate another of the historian's duties since the time of Thucydides, that is to tease out the causes that can, of course, only be understood retrospectively. In a way, cultural and interior histories always have trouble with this issue, as it's harder to find the causes for thinking than doing. There's also the great problem of avoiding the anecdotal or requiring universal consent in the accounting for the history of cultural affairs. One can always find a few examples of someone who thinks differently, and how are we to know if one poet or one trench dweller speaks for all? By contrast, analyses of economic structures and political leaders at least point us to what Ranke and the 19th century historians called wirksam factors, things that had major real world effects. There's not much of this sort of analysis in Helmut's book, deliberately and understandably, as we have hundreds of such volumes already. But going forward, how do we knit poetry and economic structures together? How do we combine analyses of the national mentalite with our understanding, or at least it's mine, that at least 90% of the time, it is the stubborn outliers who actually move the historical needle? Perhaps that's another challenge and question for the future. So in closing, let me just pose a couple of questions. First of all, it goes back to things Helmut already addressed just now in the answer to Charlie's question. Can we take the danger out of German history, and what does that do both to the content and to the moral lessons that we have been perhaps falsely living off of for the last 50, 60 years? Secondly, do you believe there are any continuities in the history of German anti-Semitism? If not, continuities in national thinking? And then thirdly, to paraphrase a question once asked by Till von Roden, can national catastrophes have shallow causes? So I'll stop there. And again, thank you for an incredibly thought-provoking, brave, and beautiful book, which we shall all be commenting on and discussing for many years to come.
Thanks so much. Wonderful. Helmut?
Thank you very much, Sue. It's humbling to hear you. Thank you also about the literary dimension of the book. I worked very hard on this aspect. As you know, my wife, Maike Werner, is also a scholar of German literature, so it's something that hangs as it ought to in the house. But it still meant I had to work very hard on this aspect of it and read a good deal of the scholarship of German literature scholars. And it's a thing I think that we historians maybe don't do enough. But to come to your hard questions. So let me say about the continuities, and let me take anti-Semitism. Let me bring it together with a comment about the structure of the work. So there is a sense in which when I break it up, you don't really see those things in the earlier parts that are there, and they're not doing the kind of explanatory work that we would like it to do. I do talk about anti-Semitism a number of times in the early chapters. It just isn't featured. I talk about the expulsions. I talk about those anti-Semitic woodcuts in Schädel. I talk about the anti-Semitism of the early 19th century and how it distressed Rahel Levine. But you're absolutely right. It's in other narratives, so it doesn't come out as having a kind of explanatory thrust. I talk about Treitschke, but that section is pared down. So I do take your, I do understand what you're saying. I'm not sure there was a very good way to avoid that, given what became very important for the larger argument, which was about how different these nations are in very different times. I was hoping that these would be threads, but I absolutely agree with you. I could have worked to make them more arguments than threads, and especially in those later chapters by bringing this back in. And yes, but if you ask me personally, what my own thought is that yes, there are important continuities in the history of anti-Semitism. Expulsion, famously Raoul Hilberg argued this already in the 60s, that expulsion was a kind of template that the Nazis borrowed. Where did they borrow it from? the 16th century. That doesn't mean that that is in force the whole time, but it's in the tradition of Christian-Jewish relations, and it is what the Nazis first turned to. So yes, I do think that the longue durée is important for a story like that. I don't think it's the longue durée, 2,000 years, but I do think it's the longue durée from the medieval period, and it's worth bringing in. You're not wrong to say that the narrative structure militates against that. So I both agree with the criticism, but not for myself, the analysis that doesn't see any continuity there. And this is also in a way the same story with nationalism per se, right? The argument isn't so much, or at least I didn't want it to be so much, that nationalism in the nationalist age, in that period 14 to 45, or as you rightly point out, maybe 1918, 1924, when it takes this turn. I don't want to suggest that it has no continuities. That's why Treitschke is in there at all. That's why Heinrich Class is in there at all. It could be that because I have spent so much of my life writing about these people, that whatever I wrote about them just didn't feel fresh to me. And so I wrote a little bit less than maybe I should have. But I think that what is really important to the Kaiserreich, where we used to draw that continuity, is something else. And this is this idea of banal nationalism. Or to take another viewpoint, when W.E.B. Du Bois, as a young student, as a Harvard student, who was a Fisk student down the road here in Nashville before, when he goes to Germany and he spends time in Berlin, he actually loves this feeling of community, of nation, however you want to call it. And he loves all the accoutrements. He grows a mustache in the Kaiser's style. I mean, it's just, he's drawn to it. And I think that one has to, in explaining the long-term depth of nationalism, one has to explain also why it came to mean something, why nation in this case came to mean something to so many people. Because I think for most of the book, and here I take, the arguments, the criticisms about national indifference and so on, I take those as genuine and as real and having some weight. But if that's true, we have to ask, what are we looking at? And we are looking at a phenomenon which is an elite phenomenon for a very, very long time. I think that to come to Charlie's point in his comment about these other levels, about Heimat or locality, Mac Walker's book, I think it's very late in the game that you would meet, no, actually that's not even the right way to put it, that the primary identification of Germans from various small towns would have been German, or that would have been what they surround their house in with, things with. So I do think we have to take the sociology of German nationalism seriously. And I think that the sociology has a kind of real depth only late in the 19th century, and then less as this kind of bellicose nationalism and more as banal nationalism. In the 1920s, that becomes a different story. And it's in that moment that I think it becomes very dangerous. And it becomes very dangerous because it's swept up, and this is the argument of this section, it's swept up with an ideology of sacrifice. How do you justify the immense amount of bloodletting in World War I? And here there's a whole new, as you know, there's a whole new research agenda that starting to see the Weimar Republic not as an anteroom to 1933, but also not just for itself either, but as a powerful ways, a kind of post-war society. And I was very influenced by this turn. And that to me made how it is that you justify what Hegel called the slaughter bench of history, how you justify that in the public space, absolutely central. And that was nationalism's moment, I think, in that radical extreme way that it didn't have to be. There could have been another way of doing that, but that was the Trojan horse. So yes, that means that in some ways this is a shorter range answer to the catastrophe.
Thank you. We have a very distinguished audience. You can't tell, but Eric and I can scroll down the attendee list, and it's really a who is who in German studies and history. But Charlie, did you have a follow-up question for Helmut?
It's not really it. If I can get it at the end, we get a chance, that would be fine. Let the audience get there.
Okay, Eric, you had, I think, a quick question, and then, yeah.
Yes, so I am not a German historian, so forgive me if I'm stepping in areas or should know more than I do. I was struck by how little space was devoted to German colonialism, late 19th, early 20th century. And you talk very briefly, there's like a paragraph about German Southeast Africa and German Southwest Africa, 2 wars that are fought. And yes, relatively few German casualties, perhaps 1,000 you say, but 250,000 Africans are killed in these wars. So does the German colonial experience play a role? And if so, how much? And if not, why not?
So for not being a German historian, you've put your finger on one of the regrets that I have. That if I were given a chance to do it, to do another half a year of revisions, I would have done that differently. I've written on German colonialism in earlier iteration of my scholarly career. I do think it's important. I think the reason why it became less of a factor for me in the book, though I think that if one were to expand the book, it ought to be in the, you're absolutely right. But it became less of a factor paradoxically because the spatial work that I was doing was more and more focused on what ends up, what is Eastern Europe. And the turn of the Nazis to the East. Now you could say with a colonial mindset, and I would completely agree with you, but with some very different arguments than the arguments that were used in Southwest Africa, German East Africa. So I think it is a case, it is to me a little bit of a case of the draw of the Holocaust changed that narrative, because for me, while there's a Hannah Arendt argument that the genocide of the Herero and Nama is a precursor, and it's no accident that the 3 parts of that book are about anti-Semitism, imperialism, more or less, and then totalitarianism. I have come to see that connection as being less obvious. It's not a perfect answer, I know.
Thank you. Let's go to some of the questions from the audience. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the raised hand function to enter the queue, and then I will call on you, and please unmute yourself once I've called on you. We'll start with Jeffrey Herf. Jeff? Jeff? Here we go. Please.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Helmut, I have not read your book. It sounds splendid. My question is, what does the history over a period of 400 years explain about the Holocaust and the catastrophe of the mid-20th century that wouldn't be explained by works of history that deal just with the 20th century? What does writing about the nation over this very long period explain that a shorter term perspective leaves out?
Well, I think you're right in the sense of, in terms of the actual, to take the Holocaust chapter in there called Death Spaces, there's very little that in there that I think that you as a historian of many aspects of German history, but also the Holocaust, I don't think there are parts in there where you would say, this is something I've never thought about before. Except to say that I think that it's not so much what you learn in that chapter that you've never thought of before as a situating of that phenomenon in a history of German nation thinking and nationalism. And in particular, I essentially see the dynamic that leads to the Holocaust as a dynamic of extreme or radical nationalism based on what you might, or I might also call a nationalism with sacrifice as the core of its rhetoric. Both the sacrifice that one gives to die for the fatherland and the sacrifice in National Socialist discourse, the sacrifice of groups within the nation who are thought to make it weak, impure. And this, of course, is among other groups, but centrally Jews. So the bringing together of these two sacrificial discourses is something that I tried to do in the preface to that long section on German, on the nationalist age. And so to understand that within a history of nationalism, within the history of nation thinking, that's where I see the contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll go next to Jonathan Sperber.
All right. So Helmut, you've heard this comment, but I'd like to throw it out here for a broader audience. All our discussion about the nation today has been linking it to territory. It seems to me that in the 20th century, the sense of being German is less linked to a territory, because what's the German national territory sort of expands and contracts like an accordion, as it is to governmental and social institutions. Being German is about claims on a social insurance system. It's about die wohlverdienten Rechte der Beamten. It's about qualifications, diplomas, educational things, craft designations, apprenticeships, and master diplomas and all that sort of stuff. And if we think of 20th century German nationhood in that way, perhaps we can see how it persists over very different political regimes, different socioeconomic regimes, and sort of marks a break with a lot of the way the nation is perceived in the past.
I agree. So I agree with you, Jonathan. And it's why in this book there's a part. The second part is called the Copernican turn, and part of that Copernican turn is the entry of states into this discourse. Now, the initial states that we're talking about, like Bavaria, like Prussia, are not. They're not the German nation. Though part of the argument of precisely those sections is that those places, and maybe Württemberg too, maybe Hanover too, we could all have a discussion about this, those places had the capability of becoming nations. And in fact, that rhetoric was already in existence. I genuinely think that if you could imagine the future of the Holy Roman Empire circa 1800, as a future in which there are different nations within a German-speaking space, much like you see in South America with Spanish-speaking nations, with different territorial containers. And you might well have, it is entirely possible. It's only hindsight that makes it harder for us to imagine. But I think it was entirely possible to imagine the emergence of a country in the year 1800, of a country called Bavaria, and we might now be talking about Bavarian nationalism, or the same thing with Prussia. So I think that there is, I think that the state is really central to this, exactly as you say, but I think that in the 19th century, you had competing possibilities here. One side, a more state-centered discourse, this essentially Abigail Green's notion of fatherlands, and another side, a wider German national discourse. There's no reason, there's no a prior reason why it wasn't possible. Maybe after 1848, this was more difficult, but certainly even in the early 19th century, to think about Germany as, like German-speaking Central Europe, as a space that could have harbored a series of nations precisely for the reasons that you adduce, which are state reasons. And I hope that in the book, I make that clear. I tried to in various points. I tried to say, for example, we have a collection of utopias, like future utopias of what people imagined the long-term game of the 18th century of the Holy Roman Empire to be. Very few people actually imagined that this would live on forever. What they did is they imagined the territorial state would be there. In what kind of formation, who knows? So I actually agree with you about the centrality of the state to later formations of nation thinking. And I also think it's part of why the nation narrative becomes, in a way, more, as Charlie pointed out, more conventional, because those structures are there, and they do shape what is possible.
Thank you. If I could ask for succinct questions and answers, as we have a lot of questions, a lot of hands raised. We'll next go to Andreas Daum. Andreas Daum.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you to the Wilson Center, and of course to all three panelists. It has already been an incredibly stimulating experience listening to you. I would be interested in asking Helmut for the implications of your approach to German history for historiography at large. One is tempted to read your book as a kind of plea to bringing the nation back in, both as a concept and as a experience. But one can also read it as an attempt to bring back a German narrative, which would be slightly different, so comparable to Clark's book on Prussia, which Charlie Mayer has already mentioned. Now, if either of that would be true, the question arises, how would you position yourself vis-a-vis the more postmodern attempts to speak of a German past as a shattered past? If it is a German narrative, would it have the potential to be applied to other nations as well? And after all, Helmut, the best of research on nationalism and nations has always been comparative in nature. And just a very brief follow-up, we haven't yet talked about your argument about war and peace, and obviously you're making an effort to recalibrating this balance. Much of that, with the big exception of the 20th century, but pre-1933, perhaps pre-1914, is a European story. There were more victims of war in Europe in the 18th century than in the 19th century. So Prussia's story and the story of Imperial Germany is partially a European story. And perhaps you can pick out one or two of these aspects to expand on.
Okay, thank you, Andy. These are all very good and not exactly easy questions. I guess I would say that I am, I really didn't think of writing I don't know what I was thinking, to be honest with you, but it's my idea. I know my idea is that we have to take the nation, we continue to have to take it seriously. And so part of the impetus for writing the book certainly is that transnational moment, which I was very fond of and very interested in. And in fact, one of the reasons why I began to think about this book like this was reading Osterhammer's work and thinking, I cannot do what he can do, which is languages, worlds. There's one thing I know a little bit better than the guy on the street, is that this history. And so I said, the other place that I can go is back in time. It's not a polemic against global history or transnational history, but it is a plea to take the nation seriously. And that's both a historiographical plea and it's a political plea. And because I think, as I mentioned in response to Charlie's first questions, because I think that we don't do so on at our peril. So that's largely how I saw the intervention. In terms of the war and peace, I'm glad you brought it up, because this wasn't an idée fixe of mine. I looked at what the political scientists call the conflict catalog. And the conflict catalog simply is a gigantic spreadsheet that basically tells how many years, how many states are involved with how many casualties. And of course, it's a lot of guesswork. But when you do the numbers, you do realize that the numbers don't fall out the way our historiography, or at least an older version of it, would have you think. And it shows Austria as a more military threat and power, as indeed it was a more powerful place for a very long period between the 18th and the middle of the 19th century. It shows that far from Germany, I mean, we used to always hear Germany is so militaristic because it's constantly being overrun by other countries. Well, if you look at the conflict catalog, it actually doesn't seem like that at all. The average number of years of England and France and even Russia involved in wars is actually greater. So to me, the German history of militarism seemed in need of a different context and that led me to think about nationalism. I mean, if you think about it, German nationalism in the 19th century is a phenomenon that grows in one of the most peaceful periods. And I decided to give that some weight.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to former ABC News national correspondent, Jean Martin. John? Unmute yourself, please. Please unmute yourself. John, please unmute yourself. There you go.
There we go. Sorry for the delay. This is a fabulous book. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm coming at it as what I call a recovering journalist. I'm not a scholar, but a journalist. And I spent some time in Germany as an American soldier in the 60s. And I'm wondering in a very simplistic way if what the Americans were doing at that point, which was to send professional journalists right after the war and a bit longer to all the journalistic outlets in Germany and trying to teach them how American journalism was conducted. And obviously it was just in the American zone. I'm wondering if you discovered at the end of that time, leading up to 2000, is there any clues left that there was an American background given to a lot of the journalistic outlets in Germany? Is there a flavor of American journalism there, or is it already gone by now?
Brief answer.
There are people in the audience who could no doubt answer this wonderful question better than I can. I'm going to just say one brief thing. I do think that the perception of high American journalism is alive, or has been through the period that you're talking about, alive and well with considerable influence. The one place that I see it in the book, and I talk about it, is not so much in journalism, but that's in poll taking. And there, one of my doctoral students actually wrote a dissertation on this very fact of Gallup poll people influencing the beginning of the Allensbach Institute. So there is an awful lot of direct and indirect influence on the formation of the public sphere in Germany, and obviously particularly West Germany, and it most definitely extended to German journalism. So thank you for that question. It's a really good one.
Thank you. Why don't we, since we're just about out of time, take a few questions at a time. Let me call on Brad Morris. Brad Morris. Please unmute yourself.
Hi, Brad Morris. My question, I sent it as an email, I'm pulling it up. Okay. How do you evaluate the Sonderveg thesis as a cultural construct of national identity? In the historiography of general surveys of German history, I sense that recent historians make a point to debunk or possibly uphold the Sonderveg thesis. What is your take on this?
Well, I do, the Sonderveg thesis, it was in an earlier version of my book, it was a part of a chapter, and I'll tell you the part that I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be an expression of nation thinking beyond or after nationalism. And my example was the whole Bielefeld school that actually developed the Sonderweg to begin with. Hans Ulrich Wehler may be the most prominent among them. But these were people who thought in national terms. The whole Sonderweg, that whole Bielefeld school was it was a way of approaching German history that operated within the national container. And when it made comparisons from nation to nation. So it really was very much in that mode. But it wasn't actually, the whole purpose of it was not to stoke German nationalism. Actually, if anything, it was the reverse. So I think you're absolutely right about the Sonderweg as it was formulated being a cultural construct. And I think within my story, had I kept it in and created a somewhat longer book, would have had that precisely that function as one of the many examples of how it is possible to think of nationhood and that be a dominant category and yet it not be nationalism.
Thank you. Michael Goodman has been waiting patiently, but I also want to call after that, give Charlie and Sue, if you'd like, another chance to join the conversation. Michael?
Yeah, hello. You made references to the longue durée, which are quite legitimate. I was also going to say that there are profound changes even in a short period of time, like say the 40 or 50 years following the conclusion of World War II. The changes that I've done some research on are the question of the names given to both German states, whether through abbreviations or their official name or by directionals. And I read an interesting article that came out in the 90s with the title Deutschland ein Name in Wandel, which analyzed the percentages of usage of the different possible names for Germany or the GDR or West Germany. It just analyzed how those evolved over time. So I think that is fairly interesting example of how one could say the concept of nationalism changed noticeably even in a period of 45 years. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I would love to see that article if you could type in the reference. What I will say about names is what I became very interested on, and there's some of it in the book, is about names, actually people's names. And one of the things that is possible to do is to chart the kinds of names that people give their children. And lo and behold, it is the case that those Germanic names cascade downwards in the 50s and in the 60s. And what you have instead are other kinds of names or religious names. My own name, Helmut, I was born in 62, but it's only because of a soccer goal in the 1953 World Cup by a guy named Helmut Rahn that name probably was still in currency. My grandfather was the captain of a local soccer team. So, but otherwise, all those kinds of names like Helmut and Siegfried became tremendously out of fashion by the 1960s. And there's a reason for that. And that has to do with that turning away from that kind of nationalism that reigned in the earlier period.
Thank you. Charlie, Sue, any further comments or questions?
Well, I was struck, I mean, this notion of our beginning questions for Helmut the map, but also I think he's been wrestling with his own sense of identity, of being, I don't know the ancestry as a whole, but somewhere in there, Helmut's got this big block of Germanness on his shoulder that he has to come to terms with. And when I went to Germany 10 years after World War II, I was from a secularized Jewish family that had come from Germany in the 19th century, not the 30s. And how to put these, nice people I lived with the AFS together with this story, which of course Helmut also tells in very heartrending and effective detail, and the detective work that's gone into sorting out those claims is very good. And I think we do get questions left by our identity. I decided at a certain point I didn't want to spend my life having to deal with this. It's like an infinite psychoanalysis, you've got to call it quits. What I really like is the sense of that, existential questioning and not just academic questioning. It's very beautiful and important in that sense. I wonder, to take the nation seriously. I mean, the nice crowds at the World Cup. I liked the crowds at the Wrapped Reichstag. They were not national. The question I begin with, today, I think more than ever, that old question that we thought we could resolve, separating Mazzini from Treitschke, for instance, or good nationalism, the nationalism of the resistance in France or in Italy from the difficult nationalism. I think up until the 1960s, through the 60s, or in the 60s, we were able to do that. We created a nationalism which was unproblematic in many senses. Now, the question of you rightly talk about the Jewish legacy or anti-Jewish legacy from the Middle Ages. It's not only in Germany, of course. The British expelled, the English expelled their Jews in 1391, the Spanish in 1492, etc. In a sense, we now are confronting the same question with race. Can we construct an American nationalism which isn't racist? I mean, which isn't George Floyd. I ask myself whether the Confederacy, if it had fought to the North to a truce, and even if it had liberated its slaves somewhere around the same time Brazil did, whether it had a genuine national identity. And I leave that the Americanists. But so I think we are coming back. This book is timely, but it will be timely in a sense that, Helmut, I think you resolved it at a time we all had a great deal more hope in the coexistence of these types of concepts of nation without nationalism, or without the nation being in opposition. And I think the big question for us is whether whether, your book will have arrived at an equilibrium that will remain, or whether in some sense there are going to be reversions, which are really unpleasant. But thank you for writing and talking about it.
Thank you, Charlie.
May I just add to that about the current moment and implicit contrast? We are all products of zeitgeist in a certain way, and one wonders what you think about the recent spate of books about Germany doing things better. I mean, the implicit contrast has now become to us, to the United States, I think, rather than as it might once have been to Japan in those older books. And perhaps, as our own sensibilities have darkened about our past, perhaps we've come to a more modest set of comparative reflections.
Yeah.
Your final words, Helmut?
Well, my final word is thank you for your comments and questions. I was very cognizant of this because my editor at Live Right, W.W. Norton Live Right, Bob Weil, asked me to write an epilogue. It's the last thing I ever wanted to do because I'm a historian, and that moment where you have to say this is where we are is a scary moment as a scholar, because you have to. And it's interesting to me because what I was worried about at that time was, of course, the AfD. And the AfD seemed to be rising. So the question I had to ask myself was, do I think that the German polity has that kind of equilibrium at the moment to deal effectively with this problem? And now, Sue, as you point out, when the book came out in the first week of the COVID lockdown in the United States, very soon there was a very different tune about Germany. And so one doesn't really know where, and that was too late for me to address, obviously. But I will say that I have a great deal of respect for Angela Merkel. I think that when you're in the United States and you see that level of, however you want to call it, conservative, responsible leadership, it's an impressive sight, and I think we're not wrong to look in that direction and see that that things can be done differently than they are here. And so, yeah, that's what I would conclude on, because historians aren't good at talking about the future. So if we can at least try to get the past right, that's already a tall order for us.
Thank you. With thanks to all three of you for just an amazing, wonderful discussion this afternoon. With my great apologies to lots of people who I couldn't call on, let me turn this over to Eric for the conclusion of the seminar. Eric?
Yes, final word. So yes, thank you, Helmut, Charlie, Sue, and Christian, as well as those of you posing questions from the audience. We'll be back this coming Monday, October 26th at 4 p.m., and we invite you to join us again for the next installment of the Washington History Seminar, this one featuring historian Ellen Du Bois's book, Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote. And until then, please take care and, of course, stay safe.